Long before the war we now call World War I, there was another, even bigger conflict that stretched across the entire globe. It was a war fought on land and sea in the forests of North America, the fields of Europe, and the hot plains of India. This was the 7 Years' War. It began in 1756 and ended in 1763. For those 7 years, the world's most powerful countries battled for control of land, trade, and power. This wasn't just a small fight between two kings, it was a massive struggle that involved millions of people and decided the fate of entire continents. It was, in many ways, the very first World War. Why was this war so important? Because it completely redrew the map of the world. At the end of it all, Great Britain would stand as the most powerful empire on earth, controlling vast new territories. France, its greatest rival, would be humbled, losing almost all of its colonial lands in North America and India. A small German kingdom called Prussia would prove that it was a major military power to be feared. And in the American colonies, the seeds of a new revolution would be planted, a revolution that would create the United States of America. This war set the stage for the modern world we live in today. Understanding the 7 Years' War helps us understand how our world came to be. It shows us how countries can be connected by competition and conflict, even when they are thousands of miles apart. The soldiers who fought in the snowy forests of Canada were fighting for the same cause as those fighting under the hot sun of India. The decisions made by kings and queens in London, Paris, and Berlin had life or death consequences for people all over the planet. It was a story of great heroes and terrible defeats, of brilliant strategies and unbelievable luck. It was a story that changed everything. The war had many different names depending on where you were. In America, it was called the French and Indian War because it was a fight between the British colonists and the French, who were allied with many Native American tribes. In Europe, it was sometimes called the Third Silesian War, focused on a piece of land that Prussia and Austria both wanted. But when we look at the whole picture, we see that all these smaller wars were part of one giant interconnected conflict. It was a global chess game where the prize was the future of the world itself, and every move had global consequences. To understand this giant war, you have to know the teams. On one side was a powerful alliance led by Great Britain and the Kingdom of Prussia. Britain was a growing empire with the most powerful navy in the world. It wanted to expand its colonies and control trade routes across the oceans. Its main rival was France. Prussia was a smaller but very tough German state with a large, well-trained army. Its king, Frederick the Great, was a brilliant and ambitious military leader. Together, Britain and Prussia formed a team designed to challenge their rivals on both land and sea. On the other side was an even bigger alliance. This team was led by France, Austria, and Russia. France, like Britain, had a massive overseas empire and a powerful army. It was in a constant struggle with Britain for control of North America and India. Austria, a large and historic empire in the heart of Europe, was angry. It had recently lost a valuable piece of land called Silesia to Prussia and was determined to get it back. Russia, a vast and mighty empire to the east, also saw Prussia's growing power as a threat. These three giants were later joined by Sweden, Saxony, and Spain, making their team incredibly strong on paper. The reasons for fighting were complicated. In Europe, the main issue was about power and land. Austria's Empress, Maria Theresa, deeply resented Frederick the Great for taking Silesia. She worked for years to build an alliance that could crush him and his upstart kingdom of Prussia. For France, the main goal was to stop Britain's colonial expansion and protect its own valuable territories and trade. They saw Britain as their primary enemy, a nation of shopkeepers who were getting too rich and too powerful. The war in Europe was a tangled web of old grudges and new ambitions. In the colonies, the fight was much simpler. It was about land and money. In North America, both British and French colonists wanted to control the rich Ohio River Valley for its valuable fur trade and fertile farmland. This competition had already led to small battles even before the war officially started. In India, both the British and French East India Companies were fighting for control over the incredibly wealthy trade in spices, textiles, and other goods. They made alliances with local Indian rulers, turning the subcontinent into another battleground. It was a global rivalry for resources and influence. The 7 Years' War didn't start with one single event, but with a series of sparks that lit a global fire. In North America, tensions had been rising for years. In 1754, a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington was sent into the Ohio Valley to tell the French to leave a fort they had built on land claimed by Britain. The mission ended in a small battle, and then another. These skirmishes in the American wilderness were the first shots of a conflict that would soon spread across the world. The fight for control of the American frontier had begun, pulling the great empires of Britain and France toward a full-scale war. Meanwhile, in Europe, the old alliances were breaking apart, and new ones were forming in an event called the Diplomatic Revolution. For a long time, Britain and Austria had been friends, but Austria, obsessed with getting its revenge on Prussia, started talking to its old enemy, France. This was a shocking change. Seeing this, Britain decided it needed a new, strong partner on the continent to protect its interests, especially the King's German territory of Hanover. So, in 1756, Britain made a deal with Prussia, promising to give them money to help fight the French. This agreement pushed Austria and France even closer together. The final decisive move came from Prussia's king, Frederick the Great. He knew his enemies were gathering around him. Austria, France, and Russia were forming a massive coalition that planned to attack and destroy his kingdom. Rather than wait to be attacked, Frederick decided to strike first. In August 1756, he launched a surprise invasion of the neighboring state of Saxony, which was allied with Austria. He hoped a quick victory would shock his enemies and disrupt their plans. Instead, his aggressive action finalized the anti-Prussian alliance and officially started the war in Europe. Frederick's invasion of Saxony was a bold and risky gamble. He quickly surrounded the Saxon army and forced it to surrender. He then did something shocking. He forced the captured Saxon soldiers to join his own army. This act was seen as brutal and aggressive by the other powers in Europe. It confirmed their fears that Frederick was a dangerous and unpredictable ruler who needed to be stopped. With Britain and Prussia now locked in a struggle against the combined might of France, Austria, and Russia, the stage was set. The conflicts in America and Europe had merged into one great global war. In Europe, the war was a desperate struggle for survival for Frederick the Great and his Prussian kingdom. He was surrounded by enemies who had far more soldiers and resources. In 1757, things looked incredibly bleak. An Austrian army defeated him at the Battle of Kolin, forcing him to retreat from Bohemia. A French army pushed into Hanover, a Russian army invaded from the east and defeated his troops, and a small Austrian force even managed to raid and briefly occupy his capital city, Berlin. It seemed that Prussia was about to be crushed under the weight of its powerful foes. But just when all seemed lost, Frederick pulled off two of the most brilliant victories in military history. First, in November 1757 at the Battle of Rossbach, his small army of 22,000 Prussians faced a combined French and Austrian force of over 40,000. Using speed and surprise, Frederick completely shattered the enemy army in less than 2 hours. 1 month later, at the Battle of Leuthen, he faced an even greater challenge. With about 33,000 men, he attacked an Austrian army of 80,000. Using a clever tactic called the oblique order, he concentrated his forces on one weak point and rolled up the enemy line. It was a stunning victory that saved his kingdom for the time being. The years that followed were a brutal grind. Frederick fought battle after bloody battle, winning some and losing others. In 1758, he fought the Russians to a bloody draw at the Battle of Zorndorf. In 1759, he suffered his worst defeat at the Battle of Kunersdorf, where a combined Russo-Austrian army nearly destroyed his entire force. Frederick was so devastated that he considered giving up. He later called the survival of his kingdom after this defeat the first miracle of the House of Brandenburg, because his enemies argued amongst themselves and failed to deliver a final blow. Throughout these years, Prussia was kept afloat by money from its ally, Great Britain, and by Frederick's sheer determination. He scraped together new armies and continued to fight even as his lands were ravaged and his resources dwindled. The war in Europe became a grim contest of endurance. Frederick's goal was no longer to win a glorious victory, but simply to survive. He had to hold on long enough for his enemies to get tired of fighting. His small kingdom was bleeding, but it was not yet broken. He just needed a little more time and a little more luck. While Frederick fought for his life in Europe, Britain and France were locked in a struggle for control of North America. In the early years of the war, things went very well for the French. They were outnumbered by the British colonists, but they had a professional army led by a skilled commander, the Marquis de Montcalm. More importantly, they had strong alliances with many Native American tribes, like the Huron and Algonquin, who were expert forest fighters. The French and their allies won a series of victories, capturing important British forts like Fort Oswego and Fort William Henry. The British had a huge advantage in numbers, with over 1 million colonists compared to France's roughly 150,000. However, their military efforts were disorganized at first. The different British colonies often refused to cooperate with each other, and their generals made some costly mistakes. The tide began to turn in 1758 when a new leader in the British government, William Pitt, took charge of the war effort. Pitt decided to pour massive amounts of money, soldiers, and ships into winning the war in America. He chose better generals and worked to improve relations with Britain's own Native American allies, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. The year 1759 was Britain's Annus Mirabilis, or Year of Miracles, and nowhere was this more true than in North America. British forces captured key French positions one after another. They took Fort Niagara, cutting off the French from the Great Lakes. They captured Fort Ticonderoga, a strategic stronghold in New York. But the most important battle was for Quebec City, the capital of New France. In a daring move, British General James Wolfe secretly moved his army up a steep cliff at night to surprise the French on a field outside the city called the Plains of Abraham. The battle that followed was short but decisive. The disciplined British soldiers fired devastating volleys into the French lines, shattering their army. Both commanders, Wolfe and Montcalm, were killed in the fighting, but the British had won the day. They captured Quebec City. The next year in 1760, the British captured Montreal, the last major French city in Canada. With the fall of Montreal, French power in North America was effectively broken. The British had conquered Canada, achieving their primary goal in the war and, well, forever changing the destiny of the continent. Half a world away from the forests of America, Britain and France were also fighting for control in India. Both countries had trading posts and forts along the coast, run by powerful private companies, the British East India Company and the French East India Company. These companies acted almost like their own governments, with their own armies. They competed fiercely for influence with the local Indian rulers, who governed parts of the declining Mughal Empire. The 7 Years' War turned this commercial rivalry into a full-blown military conflict. The key turning point in India came in 1757. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was allied with the French and had recently captured the British trading post at Calcutta. In response, the British East India Company sent a small but determined force led by a brilliant and ruthless commander named Robert Clive. At the Battle of Plassey, Clive's army of about 3,000 soldiers faced the Nawab's massive army of 50,000. It seemed like an impossible fight, but Clive had a secret weapon. He had made a deal with one of the Nawab's key commanders, Mir Jafar, promising to make him the new ruler if he betrayed his master. When the battle began, large parts of the Nawab's army under Mir Jafar's command simply stood by and did nothing. A sudden rainstorm soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, making his cannons useless. Clive's forces, who had protected their ammunition, took advantage of the confusion and attacked. The Nawab's huge army fell apart, and he was forced to flee. The British suffered very few casualties. After the battle, Clive installed Mir Jafar as the new puppet ruler of Bengal. This single victory gave the British East India Company control over the immense wealth of Bengal, the richest province in India. The money and resources from Bengal allowed the British to fund their war effort, not only in India but around the world. With their new power, they systematically began to push the French out of the subcontinent. In 1760, the British won another decisive victory at the Battle of Wandiwash. The following year, they captured Pondicherry, the capital of French India. Just as they had done in North America, the British had effectively eliminated their European rival. The Battle of Plassey marked the beginning of British dominance in India, laying the foundation for what would become the British Raj, which would rule India for nearly 200 years. The year 1759 was remembered in Great Britain as the Annus Mirabilis, or the Year of Miracles. It was a year of incredible victories on every front. In North America, the British captured Quebec. In India, their forces were driving the French into retreat, and at sea, the Royal Navy asserted its dominance. In August, a British fleet defeated a French fleet at the Battle of Lagos, off the coast of Portugal. Then, in November, in the stormy waters of Quiberon Bay, another British fleet under Admiral Hawke smashed the main French fleet, ending any hope France had of invading Britain. These global victories were a testament to Britain's strategy, led by William Pitt. He used Britain's powerful navy to blockade French ports, cutting off their colonies and trade. This crippled the French economy and prevented them from sending reinforcements and supplies to their armies in America and India. At the same time, he sent huge sums of money to Frederick the Great in Prussia. This financial support allowed Frederick to keep fighting in Europe, tying down the main French army so that Britain could focus on winning the colonial war. It was a brilliant and brutally effective strategy. But while Britain celebrated, its ally Prussia was on the brink of collapse. After the disastrous defeat at Kunersdorf in 1759, Frederick the Great's kingdom was exhausted. His armies were shrinking, and his enemies were closing in. The war dragged on through 1760 and 1761, with Frederick barely hanging on. By the end of 1761, the situation looked hopeless. The Russians had captured a key fortress in Pomerania, and the Austrians were advancing in Silesia. It seemed only a matter of time before Prussia would be forced to surrender and be carved up by its enemies. Then, in January 1762, the impossible happened. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, one of Frederick's most determined enemies, suddenly died. Her nephew Peter III became the new Tsar. Peter was a huge admirer of Frederick the Great. One of his first acts was to pull Russia out of the war. He made peace with Prussia and even returned all the land Russia had conquered. This stunning turn of events was what Frederick called the second miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Freed from the war on his eastern front, Frederick could now turn all his attention to the Austrians. This miracle saved Prussia from certain destruction. The Russian exit from the war changed everything in Europe. Sweden soon followed, making peace with Prussia. Although Peter III was quickly overthrown by his wife, Catherine the Great, she decided to keep Russia out of the conflict. With his enemies weakened, Frederick the Great was able to go on the offensive. He won several key victories against the Austrians in late 1762, securing his control over the long-disputed territory of Silesia. Austria, exhausted and now fighting without its powerful Russian ally, realized it could not win. The war in Europe was finally winding down. At the same time, the war had expanded to include Spain. Worried about Britain's growing power, Spain allied with France in 1762 and declared war. This proved to be a terrible mistake. The British war machine, now at the peak of its power, was unstoppable. A British naval expedition swiftly captured Havana in Cuba, the most important Spanish port in the Americas. Another British force sailed across the Pacific and captured Manila in the Philippines. Britain's global dominance was now absolute. France and Spain, defeated on all fronts and financially ruined, had no choice but to ask for peace. The war officially ended with two separate treaties in 1763. The first was the Treaty of Paris, signed between Britain, France, and Spain. The terms were a massive victory for Britain. France was forced to give all of Canada and all its land east of the Mississippi River to Britain. It also had to give up most of its holdings in India. To compensate its ally Spain for losing Florida to the British, France gave Spain the vast Louisiana territory west of the Mississippi. In one treaty, the French colonial empire in North America was almost completely wiped out. A few days later, the Treaty of Hubertusburg was signed between Prussia, Austria, and Saxony. This treaty was much simpler. It basically returned everything to the way it was before the war started. Frederick the Great got to keep Silesia, the territory that had started the whole fight. Austria had failed in its goal of crushing Prussia. After 7 years of brutal fighting, millions of deaths and ruined lands, the borders in Central Europe had not changed at all. Prussia had survived, proving it was a major European power to be reckoned with. The 7 Years' War left the world a very different place. Great Britain emerged as the undisputed global superpower. It now controlled a vast empire that stretched from Canada to India. Its navy ruled the seas, and its trade network brought it immense wealth. But this victory came at a staggering cost. The war had been incredibly expensive, and Britain's national debt had doubled. To pay for this debt, the British government decided to impose new taxes on its prosperous colonies in America. They believed it was only fair for the colonists to help pay for a war that was fought, in part, to protect them. This decision would have world-changing consequences. The American colonists were outraged. They argued that they should not be taxed without having representatives in the British Parliament, no taxation without representation. The new taxes, combined with a growing sense of a separate American identity forged during the war, created deep resentment toward Britain. This resentment would fester and grow over the next decade, eventually exploding into the American War of Independence. In a way, by winning the 7 Years' War, Britain created the conditions that would lead to it losing its most valuable colonies. For the other powers, the results were just as profound. France was humiliated. It had lost its empire, its prestige, and was left financially broken. The enormous cost of the war would contribute to a financial crisis that, decades later, would help trigger the French Revolution. Prussia, on the other hand, had not just survived, it had solidified its status as a great European power. The war cemented the legend of Frederick the Great and the reputation of the Prussian army, setting the stage for Prussia to eventually unite Germany into a single nation in the next century. Today, the 7 Years' War is often overlooked, overshadowed by the revolutions and other world wars that followed. But its impact is all around us. It determined that the dominant language and culture in North America would be English, not French. It began the era of British rule in India, and it lit the fuse for the American Revolution, which in turn inspired countless other movements for independence and democracy around the world. By connecting the fates of continents and creating a new global balance of power, this 18th century conflict truly shaped the world we know today.